This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about something quieter and far more dangerous. It's about what happens when a system stops asking whether it's allowed to do something and starts arguing that no one is allowed to stop it. Not loudly, not dramatically, procedurally, formally, on paper. What you're watching right now isn't chaos, it's discipline. A system learning how to move faster than oversight can react. And here's the part that should make you pause. This isn't happening at the margins. It's happening inside the process that is supposed to enforce the rules. If you've been following politics long enough, you're trained to look for the villain, a face, a name, a moment you can point to. That instinct is now working against you because the real shift doesn't announce itself. It files paperwork. Stay with me, because once you see how this works, you can't unsee where it leads. And what comes next depends on whether anyone is still allowed to say stop. What actually controls the system now is not law, and it's not ideology either. It's speed. Not how fast cases are decided, how fast authority is asserted before anyone can challenge it. Because if you move quickly enough, oversight becomes theoretical. Appeals lag, judges respond one at a time. Precedent fractures by geography. And suddenly, legality becomes optional depending on where you stand. This is the shift most people miss. We're trained to think power flows downward, from the Constitution to the courts to the agencies. But what you're seeing here is power moving laterally, around obstacles, across districts, between technicalities. When challenged, the system doesn't argue it is right. It argues the question itself is invalid, that the court is out of bounds. That procedure forbids intervention. That's not defiance, that's insulation. And once a system learns it can declare itself untouchable, even temporarily, temporary becomes precedent. This is how rules don't break, they thin. And the thinning is almost complete. There was a time when this kind of conflict was rare, not because people were better, but because the cost was higher. Before, when a court raised a question, the system slowed down, paused, adjusted. Now it doesn't. What changed wasn't a law. It was a habit. Over time, a new assumption settled in, that if something is challenged in one place, it can continue everywhere else, that a ruling is local, that consequences are contained. Before, a judge's warning traveled. It stopped similar behavior elsewhere. Now warnings are treated like weather reports, not commands, information you can route around. This is the most dangerous kind of change, the kind that feels technical, boring, administrative, because no one panics when the language is dry. But normalization is powerful. Once a system learns it can absorb a ruling without changing behavior, it stops fearing rulings altogether. And here's the part that matters. Nothing dramatic had to happen for this to take hold. No emergency powers, no declaration, just repetition. And repetition is how exceptions become structure. Which brings us to the moment when this stopped being theoretical. And then the system did something it usually avoids. It collided with itself. A federal judge looked at a filing and didn't just rule on the case in front of him. He asked a different question, a procedural question. Who exactly is allowed to sign this? Not rhetorically, formally. The answer mattered, because if the signature wasn't valid in one case, it wasn't valid anywhere. And that's when the warning was issued. Quietly, on the court's own initiative. Explain why this isn't a misrepresentation. Explain why this isn't sanctionable. Explain why this shouldn't be referred for discipline. In a normal system, that's where things slow down. This one didn't. Instead, the response came back fast. Unified, aggressive, not explaining the signature, not correcting the issue, but attacking the question. Accusing the judge of overreach, of violating procedure, of abusing power by even asking, if this feels inside baseball, stay with me. Because this wasn't about one filing. It was a test, and the system just signaled it will fight oversight itself. Which raises the next question. If a court can't ask who is acting in its name, what exactly can it still stop? Here's how the system actually works now. When legality is questioned, the response isn't to prove compliance, it's to narrow the battlefield. The argument goes like this: even if something is wrong here, it's only wrong here. Even if a judge says stop, that stop sign only exists in this lane. So the system keeps moving. Cases don't pause. Signatures don't change. Authority doesn't reset. Instead, the damage is distributed across defendants, across courts, across time. Who benefits from this is obvious. The institution in motion. Speed protects it. Who absorbs the cost is quieter. Defendants prosecuted by someone whose authority is in question. Judges forced to duplicate the same ruling again and again. A court system burning time just to restate what should already be settled. And here's the key insight. This isn't sloppiness. It's design. Because if every challenge must be raised individually, oversight becomes optional. Exhaustion replaces enforcement. The system doesn't need to win every argument. It just needs to make stopping it too expensive. And once that logic is accepted, something irreversible happens. Illegality doesn't need to be hidden. It only needs to be defended loudly enough that no one wants to pursue it again. Which brings us to the moment when this stopped being sustainable. Then the collisions multiplied. Not one court, another, then another. Same question, same defect, same response, proceed anyway. Rulings came down, appointments questioned, authority rejected, and still nothing stopped. Cases moved forward as if the warning didn't exist, as if legality were optional until enforced everywhere at once. That's the acceleration. Because now the system isn't reacting to oversight. It's daring it. Every new filing becomes a gamble. Every defendant becomes collateral. Every judge becomes a bottleneck. The logic is simple. If oversight can't act collectively, it can't act effectively. And the pressure flips. Judges aren't just deciding cases anymore. They're deciding whether to trigger chaos by enforcing the rules. Because enforcing them means reopening everything, undoing work, admitting the system moved illegally for months. So the cost of stopping becomes higher than the cost of continuing. That's not a loophole. That's a trap. And once a system learns it can survive being wrong, it starts betting on it. Which brings this closer to you than you might think. This is where you enter the picture. Not as a spectator, as a variable. Because if this system can decide that authority is flexible, then your position inside it becomes fragile. If you're charged, you don't just face the accusation. You face uncertainty about who is allowed to accuse you and how long that question can be delayed. If you're waiting for the courts to catch up, you wait alone. Because the system keeps moving while review crawls. You feel this as delay, as confusion, as procedural fog. Nothing feels dramatic, but everything feels heavier. This is how trust erodes without a headline. You stop believing outcomes are final. You stop believing process protects you. You stop believing anyone is fully in control. And once that belief goes, compliance becomes conditional. Pay attention to this moment. Share it. Because systems like this don't collapse all at once. They hollow out. And what fills the hollow isn't chaos. It's power without friction, which is why this can't stay contained. What happens next is never contained. Because systems like this don't exist in isolation. They're watched, studied, copied. When oversight weakens in one place, it sends a signal everywhere else that enforcement is negotiable, that rulings are suggestions, that authority can be stretched without snapping. Other institutions notice, other governments notice, not the speeches, the mechanics. They see a system where procedure outruns accountability, where courts move slower than power, where legality is debated while action continues. And the lesson travels, not as ideology, as method. If rules only apply where enforced perfectly, then enforcement becomes the choke point. Overload it, fragment it, outpace it. This is how a local conflict becomes structural. Because once one system proves this can work, others adapt it to their own context. Different laws, same playbook. At that point, this stops being about one country's courts. It becomes a question about whether modern institutions can still restrain themselves at speed. And that question doesn't have a stable answer, which leaves us with what comes next. From here, there are only three directions this can go. The first is adjustment. The system slows itself down. Authority is clarified. Oversight reasserts itself not loudly but consistently. The cost of ignoring rulings becomes higher than compliance. That path requires coordination and patience and time the system may no longer have. The second path is erosion. Nothing breaks outright, but nothing fully works either. Challenges pile up. Rulings fragment. Confidence drains away quietly. The law still exists. It's just uneven, predictable only to those who know how to move inside it. Most people adapt. They always do. Until adaptation becomes resignation. And then there's the third path, rupture. That's when a case goes too far, when enforcement collides with legitimacy, when undoing the damage costs more than admitting it. Rupture doesn't announce itself. It arrives as a backlog, a contradiction. A moment when the system has to choose between stopping and admitting it never could. Which path this follows isn't decided yet, but the speed is increasing. And speed has a way of choosing for us. If you're waiting for a clean resolution, don't. Systems like this don't end with a verdict. They end with a normalization, a point where what once felt unthinkable just feels administrative, routine, filed away. That's the danger. Not that the rules were broken, but that the argument over whether they matter was allowed to drag on long enough to exhaust everyone watching. Because the most effective way to change a system isn't to defeat it. It's to wear down the people who still expect it to behave. What you've seen here isn't the end of anything. It's the opening of a method, one that depends on speed, on fragmentation, on the assumption that no one will follow every thread to the end. So don't look away now. This doesn't resolve itself. In the next layer of this story, the question isn't whether the system was wrong. It's whether it can still correct itself at all. That's what we'll look at next. Follow, stay with it. Because once a system learns it can ignore the referee, it never forgets, and neither should you.